In the blink of an eye, a respected federal judge became a suspect. Hands on his luxury car, dignity stripped away, Judge Marcus Thompson faced the cold reality of racial profiling. One traffic stop would ignite a national firestorm, challenging the very foundations of justice in America. This is a story of humiliation transformed into a relentless quest for change.
As I stepped out of the upscale restaurant, the cool evening air hit my face, a stark contrast to the warm atmosphere I'd just left behind. It had been a pleasant dinner with colleagues, celebrating a successful ruling on a high-profile case. I was feeling good, content with the work we'd accomplished and looking forward to heading home to my wife and kids. I walked towards my car, a sleek black Mercedes S-Class that I'd treated myself to after years of hard work climbing the judicial ladder. It wasn't just a car to me, it represented the culmination of my efforts, a symbol of how far I'd come from my humble beginnings in a working-class neighborhood. As I approached the vehicle, I noticed a police cruiser slowly rolling by. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, this was an affluent area of town and police presence wasn't uncommon. I reached for my keys, the familiar weight of the fob in my hand, a comforting sensation. Just as I was about to unlock the car, I heard the sound of tires crunching on asphalt behind me. The police cruiser had pulled up, its headlights casting long shadows across the parking lot. A feeling of unease began to creep over me, a sensation I'd experienced many times before, but had hoped wouldn't follow me to this stage of my life. "Hey, you there! Step away from the vehicle!" a voice called out, sharp and authoritative. I turned slowly, my heart rate picking up despite my efforts to remain calm. A white officer, probably in his mid-30s, was approaching me with purposeful strides, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and polite. The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked me up and down, his gaze lingering on my expensive suit before snapping back to my face. "We've had reports of car thefts in the area. Mind telling me what you're doing with this vehicle?" I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay composed. "This is my car, officer. I was just leaving the restaurant after dinner." His expression hardened, skepticism clear in his eyes. "Your car? A vehicle like this?" The implication in his tone was clear, and it stung more than I cared to admit. Here I was, a respected judge, being questioned about the ownership of my own car, simply because of the color of my skin. "Yes, officer." "This is my car. I can show you the registration if you'd like," I offered, trying to defuse the situation. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, ignoring my offer. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." I felt a surge of anger and indignation, but years of experience had taught me the importance of remaining calm in these situations. I complied with his orders, placing my hands on the cool metal of my car's roof. As the officer began to pat me down, I could feel the eyes of passers-by on us. Some slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and concern. I caught glimpses of people pulling out their phones, no doubt recording the incident. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice steady despite the humiliation I felt. "My name is Judge Marcus Thompson. If you'll allow me to reach for my identification—" "Did I say you could speak?" The officer interrupted, his voice harsh. "You can explain yourself down at the station." At that moment, I saw a couple I recognized from the restaurant walking towards their car. They paused, shock evident on their faces as they saw me being treated like a common criminal. "Judge Thompson?" the woman called out, her voice laced with confusion and concern. "Is everything all right?" The officer's head snapped towards them, his eyes narrowing. "You know this man?" "Of course," the man replied, stepping closer despite his wife's attempt to hold him back. "That's Judge Marcus Thompson. We were just having dinner with him and some other colleagues. What's going on here?" I could see the officer's demeanor change slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But instead of backing down, he seemed to double down on his suspicions. "Sir, ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is an ongoing investigation," he said, his tone brusque. "Investigation of what?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "I've done nothing wrong, officer. I'm simply trying to go home after a dinner with colleagues." The officer's radio crackled to life and he stepped away to respond, keeping a wary eye on me. I could hear him requesting backup, describing me as an uncooperative suspect. As I stood there, hands still on my car, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Just hours ago, I had been presiding over a courtroom, respected and addressed as Your Honor. Now I was being treated like a criminal, my years of service to the justice system seemingly meaningless in the face of deeply ingrained prejudice. The small crowd that had gathered was growing larger, and I could hear murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Phones were out, recording the incident, and I knew that this confrontation would likely be all over social media within the hour. "Officer," I said, trying one more time to reason with him, "I understand you're doing your job, but this is a mistake. I am a federal judge and this is my vehicle. If you'll just allow me to show you my identification..." "Listen," he cut me off, stepping closer, his voice low and menacing. "I don't care if you claim to be the president himself. Right now, you're just another suspect trying to steal a car that's way out of your league. So shut up and wait for my backup to arrive." His words hit me like a physical blow. The blatant disrespect, the assumption that someone like me couldn't possibly own a luxury vehicle. It was all too familiar, a painful reminder that no matter how far I'd come, to some, I would always be seen as less than. As we waited for the backup to arrive, I noticed more and more people gathering. Some were openly filming now, others were on their phones, likely calling the police department or local news stations. I could feel the situation spiraling out of control, and I knew I needed to stay calm and composed, not just for my own sake, but for what this incident could mean in the larger context of race relations in our community. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, another police car pulled up. An older officer stepped out, his salt and pepper hair visible under his cap. As he approached, I could see the stripes on his uniform indicating a higher rank. "What's the situation here, Officer Daniels?" he asked, his eyes moving between me and the younger officer. Before Officer Daniels could respond, I spoke up, my voice clear and controlled. "Sergeant, my name is Judge Marcus Thompson. I've been detained by Officer Daniels under suspicion of stealing my own vehicle. I've repeatedly offered to provide identification, but your officer has refused to allow me to do so." The sergeant's eyebrows shot up, and he turned to Officer Daniels. "Is this true?" Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I received reports of car thefts in the area, and this individual was acting suspiciously around this high-end vehicle." "Acting suspiciously how?" the sergeant pressed. "He was attempting to enter the vehicle, sir." I could see the realization dawning on the sergeant's face. He turned to me, his expression a mix of embarrassment and concern. "Judge Thompson, I apologize for this inconvenience. May I see your identification, please?" "Of course, Sergeant," I replied, slowly reaching into my pocket and producing my wallet. I handed over my driver's license and judicial ID. The sergeant examined them carefully before handing them back to me. "Everything appears to be in order, Your Honor. You're free to go. Officer Daniels, a word, please." As the two officers stepped aside for a hushed conversation, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. The tension that had been building in my body began to dissipate, replaced by a profound weariness. I looked around at the crowd that had gathered. Some people were shaking their heads in disgust, others looked embarrassed or ashamed. A few approached me, offering words of support and apology. As I finally got into my car, I couldn't help but think about how this incident would affect not just me, but my family, my community, and potentially the entire justice system. I knew that the coming days would be challenging, filled with media inquiries, departmental investigations, and difficult conversations. But as I started the engine, I also felt a sense of resolve growing within me. This experience, as humiliating and infuriating as it was, could be a catalyst for change. I had a platform, a voice that could be heard, and I was determined to use it to ensure that no one else would have to go through what I just did. As I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the flashing lights of the police cars and the murmuring crowd, I knew that this was far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning. As I drove home, my mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. The weight of the incident pressed heavily on my shoulders, a burden I knew I couldn't simply shrug off. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. knuckles white, as I tried to process the emotions swirling within me. Anger, humiliation, and a deep-seated frustration that, despite all my achievements, I could still be reduced to a stereotype in an instant. I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my home offering little comfort. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed my neighbor, Tom, watering his lawn. He waved, but his smile faltered as he caught sight of my expression. I managed a weak nod in return, not trusting myself to speak just yet. Inside, I found my wife, Lisa, and our 2 children, Marcus Jr. and Amelia, in the living room. The kids were engrossed in a board game, but Lisa looked up as I entered, her smile quickly fading to concern. "Marcus, what's wrong?" she asked, rising from the couch. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain to my family that their husband, their father, had been treated like a common criminal for simply existing in the wrong skin? Lisa ushered the kids upstairs, promising them we'd be up soon to say goodnight. As soon as they were out of earshot, she turned to me, her eyes searching my face. "What happened?" I sank into the armchair, suddenly feeling every one of my 52 years. Slowly, haltingly, I recounted the events of the evening. Lisa's expression shifted from shock to outrage as I described the officer's behavior, the humiliation of being forced to place my hands on my own car, the disbelief in the officer's voice when I claimed ownership of the vehicle. "Oh, Marcus," she breathed, her hand covering her mouth. "I can't believe this. We have to do something. We can't let them get away with this." I nodded, a grim determination settling over me. "You're right. We can't." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from David, one of my colleagues from dinner. "Judge, have you seen the news? It's everywhere." With a sense of dread, I turned on the TV. Sure enough, there it was, shaky cell phone footage of me, hands on my car, being confronted by Officer Daniels. The caption read, "Federal judge racially profiled in upscale neighborhood." Lisa and I watched in stunned silence as the news anchor recounted the events, interspersed with interviews from witnesses at the scene. I saw the couple from the restaurant, visibly upset as they described what they'd seen. The anchor mentioned that the police department had released a brief statement promising a full investigation into the incident. As the segment ended, my phone began to ring incessantly. Colleagues, friends, reporters, all wanting to know what had happened, all seeking my comment on the unfolding story. I turned to Lisa, feeling overwhelmed. "I need to address this. I can't let this narrative spin out of control." She nodded, squeezing my hand. "Do what you need to do. I'm here for you." I spent the next few hours on the phone, first with my close friend and fellow judge Robert, who offered his full support and advised me on how to handle the media storm. Then I spoke with my longtime mentor, retired Justice Eleanor Simmons, whose wisdom and experience had guided me throughout my career. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm but compassionate, "this is more than just an incident. This is an opportunity to shed light on a systemic issue. You have a platform now. Use it wisely." As the night wore on, I crafted a statement with Lisa's help. We decided on a measured approach, acknowledging the pain and humiliation of the experience, while also calling for a broader examination of racial profiling in law enforcement. By the time I finally crawled into bed, it was well past midnight. Sleep eluded me as I tossed and turned, replaying the evening's events in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of Officer Daniels' face, the contempt in his eyes as he looked at me. How many others had faced similar treatment without the protection of a title or the platform to speak out? The next morning, I woke to find our front lawn crowded with news vans and reporters. Lisa peeked through the curtains, shaking her head in disbelief. "Well, it's a circus out there." I nodded grimly, straightening my tie. "Time to face the music." As I stepped outside, microphones were thrust in my face, a barrage of questions assaulting my ears. I held up a hand, calling for silence, and began to deliver the statement we had prepared. "Last night I experienced firsthand the reality that many Black Americans face every day," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion roiling within me. "I was profiled, detained, and treated with suspicion and disrespect, not because of any action on my part, but solely because of the color of my skin. I went on to describe the incident in detail, emphasizing the need for accountability and systemic change. As I spoke, I could see the impact of my words on the reporters as faces: shock, sympathy, and in some cases, shame. This incident is not about me, I concluded. It's about every person of color who has ever been made to feel less than, who has been denied the basic dignity of being presumed innocent. It's about the work we still need to do as a society to overcome our biases and prejudices. I call on the police department to not only investigate this specific incident, but to examine their policies and training to ensure that no one else experiences what I did last night. As I finished, there was a moment of silence before the questions erupted once again. I answered a few, reiterating my call for change and my commitment to working towards a more just system. Back inside, my phone rang. It was the police chief requesting a meeting. I agreed, setting it for later that afternoon. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Calls poured in from civil rights organizations, offering support and resources. My colleagues in the judiciary reached out, expressing their shock and solidarity. Even the governor's office contacted me, assuring me that they were taking the incident seriously and promising a thorough review of police practices. As I prepared to leave for my meeting with the police chief, Lisa pulled me aside. "Marcus," she said, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and concern, "I know this is hard, but you're doing the right thing. You're giving a voice to so many who haven't been heard." I nodded, drawing strength from her words. "I just hope it makes a difference." The police station was surrounded by protesters when I arrived, carrying signs denouncing racial profiling and demanding justice. As I made my way through the crowd, I heard chants of "No justice, no peace," and "Black Lives Matter." It was a powerful reminder of the broader implications of what had happened to me. Inside, I was ushered into the chief's office. Chief Williams, a man I'd met at various city functions but never truly known, looked uncomfortable as he greeted me. "Judge Thompson," he began, "I want to express my deepest apologies for what happened last night. It's not reflective of the values we strive to uphold in this department." I listened as he outlined the steps they were taking. Officer Daniels had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and they were reviewing body cam footage and witness statements. He assured me that they would be implementing additional training on racial bias and community relations. "Chief," I said, leaning forward, "I appreciate your apology and these steps, but we both know this goes beyond one incident or one officer. This is about a culture that allows these biases to persist and flourish. What are you going to do to address that?" The chief shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Judge, we're committed to improving our practices. We're open to suggestions." I saw an opening and took it. "I have more than suggestions, Chief. I have a proposal. I want to work with your department to develop a comprehensive program addressing racial bias in policing. This would include not just training, but also policy changes, community engagement initiatives, and a system of accountability. Are you willing to commit to that?" The chief hesitated, likely weighing the political implications. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, Judge Thompson, we're willing to work with you on this." As I left the station, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end, far from it, but it was a start. A chance to turn a painful, humiliating experience into something positive, something that could make a real difference. Outside, the crowd of protesters had grown. As I emerged, a hush fell over them. I approached the makeshift podium that had been set up, feeling the weight of expectation on my shoulders. "Today," I began, my voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I met with Chief Williams to discuss not just my experience, but the experiences of countless others who have faced similar treatment. I'm here to tell you that the department has agreed to work with us to implement comprehensive reforms." A cheer went up from the crowd, but I held up my hand. "This is just the beginning," I continued. "The real work starts now, and I'm calling on all of you, every citizen who believes in justice and equality, to be part of this process. Together, we can turn this moment of pain into a movement for change." As the crowd erupted in applause and chants, I felt a surge of determination. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was ready for the challenge. What had started as a routine evening had become a turning point, not just for me, but potentially for our entire community. And I was determined to see it through, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. In the days that followed my confrontation with Officer Daniels, my life took on a surreal quality. The incident had sparked a national conversation, thrusting me into the spotlight in a way I'd never experienced before. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from major news networks, and my inbox overflowed with messages of support, as well as the inevitable hate mail from those who refused to acknowledge the reality of racial profiling. I found myself walking a tightrope, balancing my roles as a federal judge, a victim of racial profiling, and now, unexpectedly, an activist for police reform. It was a delicate dance, one that required careful consideration of every word I spoke and every action I took. One morning, about a week after the incident, I sat in my home office, preparing for a video interview with a national news program. As I adjusted my tie, I caught sight of my reflection in the computer screen. The man staring back at me looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. This ordeal was taking its toll, but I knew I couldn't back down now. The interview began, and the host didn't pull any punches. She asked pointed questions about the incident, pressing me on the details and my feelings in the moment. I recounted the story once again, my voice steady as I described the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of my peers and community. "Judge Thompson," the host said, leaning forward, "some people might say that this was just one bad apple, an isolated incident. What would you say to them?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I'd say that while this particular incident involved one officer, it's indicative of a much larger problem. This isn't about one bad apple. It's about the orchard that produced that apple. It's about a system that allows these biases to persist and even thrive." As the interview continued, I found myself growing more impassioned. I spoke about the countless other Black Americans who face similar treatment every day, but don't have the platform or resources to fight back. I emphasized the need for systemic change, for a complete overhaul of how we approach policing and community relations. After the interview ended, I sat back in my chair, emotionally drained. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "You did great, honey. So proud of you." Her words buoyed me, reminding me why I was putting myself through this. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about using my position and this unfortunate incident to push for real, lasting change. The next day, I received a call from Congressman James Mitchell, a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform. He'd seen my interview and wanted to discuss the possibility of turning my experience into legislative action. We met for lunch at a quiet restaurant, away from the prying eyes of the media. As we settled into our booth, Congressman Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Judge Thompson, I believe we have a real opportunity here. Your story has resonated with people across the country. We need to strike while the iron is hot." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. "What did you have in mind, Congressman?" He outlined his plan, a comprehensive bill that would address racial profiling, police accountability, and community-oriented policing practices. It was ambitious, to say the least. "We want you to testify before Congress," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Your story, coming from someone of your stature, could be the push we need to get this legislation through." I sat back, considering his words. Testifying before Congress would be a significant step, one that would undoubtedly ruffle feathers in certain circles. But isn't that exactly what was needed? A voice that couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored? "I'll do it," I said, my resolve strengthening. "But I want to be involved in crafting the legislation as well. I have some ideas based on my experiences both as a judge and now as a victim of racial profiling." Congressman Mitchell's face broke into a wide grin. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Judge." Over the next few weeks, I found myself burning the candle at both ends. By day, I continued my duties on the bench, careful to maintain the impartiality required of my position. But every evening and weekend was dedicated to working on the proposed legislation and preparing for my testimony. Lisa was my rock through it all, providing unwavering support and a sounding board for my ideas. She'd stay up late with me, poring over draft after draft of my testimony. helping me strike the right balance between personal narrative and policy recommendations. As the day of the hearing approached, I felt the weight of expectation growing heavier. I knew that my words would be scrutinized, picked apart by both supporters and detractors. The pressure was immense, but so was the potential for real change. The morning of the hearing, I stood before the mirror, adjusting my tie one last time. Lisa came up behind me, placing her hands on my shoulders. "You've got this, Marcus," she said, her eyes meeting mine in the reflection. "Just speak your truth." The hearing room was packed when I arrived. Cameras flashed as I made my way to the witness table, the low murmur of conversation dying down as I took my seat. I looked out at the sea of faces, some friendly, some skeptical, all waiting to hear what I had to say. As I began my testimony, I felt a calm settle over me. I spoke about the night of the incident, not just recounting the facts, but conveying the fear, the humiliation, the sense of powerlessness I'd felt. I saw several committee members shift uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet my gaze, but I didn't stop there. I transitioned from my personal experience to the broader issues at play. The systemic biases in our justice system, the lack of accountability, the erosion of trust between law enforcement and communities of color. "What happened to me was not unique," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "It was merely a high-profile example of what happens to Black Americans every day across this country. The only difference is I have a platform to speak out. Most don't." I outlined our proposed legislation, emphasizing the need for increased training on implicit bias, stronger accountability measures for officers who engage in racial profiling, and increased funding for community policing initiatives. "This isn't about demonizing police officers," I stressed. "It's about creating a system that serves and protects all Americans regardless of the color of their skin. It's about living up to the ideals of justice and equality that we claim to hold dear." As I concluded my testimony, a hush fell over the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, applause began to build. I looked up to see many in the audience on their feet, including several committee members. The questioning that followed was intense. Some committee members were supportive, praising my courage and asking thoughtful questions about the proposed legislation. Others were more combative, questioning the need for such sweeping reforms and suggesting that my experience was an isolated incident. I held my ground, countering each argument with facts, statistics, and personal anecdotes. When one senator suggested that I was letting my personal experience cloud my judgment, I leaned forward, looking him straight in the eye. "Senator," I said, my voice firm but measured, "my personal experience opened my eyes to a reality that many Americans face every day. But it's not just my experience that informs this legislation. It's the experiences of countless others who have faced similar treatment. It's the data that shows persistent racial disparities in police stops and use of force. And it's my years on the bench, seeing firsthand the impact of these systemic issues on our communities." As the hearing concluded, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. I knew that this was just the beginning of a long fight, but for the first time since that night in the parking lot, I felt truly hopeful. Outside the hearing room, I was mobbed by reporters, all clamoring for a comment. As I made my way through the crowd, I caught sight of a familiar face, Officer Daniels standing off to the side, watching me with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. In that instant, I saw not just the man who had humiliated me, but a symbol of a broken system. And I knew with absolute certainty that the work we were doing was not just important, it was essential. As I turned to face the cameras ready to continue the fight, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about creating a justice system that truly lived up to its name, for everyone. In the weeks following my testimony before Congress, the momentum for change continued to build. The proposed legislation, now dubbed the Thompson Act, was gaining bipartisan support, a rarity in today's polarized political climate. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny, and I found myself navigating treacherous waters, both professionally and personally. One crisp autumn morning, as I prepared for another day in court. My phone buzzed with a news alert. My heart sank as I read the headline, "Judge Thompson's impartiality questioned amid police reform advocacy." The article cited anonymous sources suggesting that my involvement in pushing for legislative change compromised my ability to rule fairly on cases involving law enforcement. I sat heavily on the edge of my bed, the weight of the accusation pressing down on me. Lisa, sensing my distress, came and sat beside me, her hand finding mine. "What is it?" she asked softly. I showed her the article, watching as her expression shifted from concern to anger. "This is ridiculous," she fumed. "You've been nothing but fair and impartial. They're just trying to discredit you because you're making waves." I nodded, knowing she was right, but still feeling the sting of the accusation. "I knew there would be pushback," I said, "but I didn't expect it to come at me professionally like this." As I made my way to the courthouse that day, I could feel the eyes on me, sense the whispers as I passed. Colleagues who had once greeted me warmly now seemed hesitant, unsure. It was a stark reminder of the delicate balance I was trying to maintain between my role as a judge and my newfound position as an advocate for change. In my chambers, I found a letter waiting for me. It was from the Judicial Conduct Committee, informing me that a formal complaint had been filed against me, citing my public advocacy as a potential violation of judicial ethics. They were launching an investigation into my conduct. For a moment, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. Was this the price of speaking out? Was I jeopardizing the career I'd worked so hard to build? But then, unbidden, the image of Officer Daniels' face flashed in my mind, followed by the faces of countless others who had suffered similar indignities. I straightened my shoulders, resolve hardening within me. I couldn't back down now, not when we were so close to real change. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Robert, my fellow judge and longtime friend. His voice was grave as he spoke. "Marcus, I've heard about the complaint. I want you to know that not everyone on the bench agrees with this witch hunt. Many of us stand behind you." His words were a balm to my battered spirit. "Thank you, Robert," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." As the investigation into my conduct dragged on, I threw myself into my work, both on and off the bench. During the day, I presided over cases with meticulous care, acutely aware of the extra scrutiny on my rulings. In the evenings, I continued to work with Congressman Mitchell and his team, refining the Thompson Act and building support for its passage. The strain was taking its toll, though. I found myself sleeping less, the weight of responsibility keeping me up late into the night. Lisa worried, urging me to take a step back, but I couldn't, not when we were so close. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, everything changed. As I was driving to the courthouse, my phone rang. It was Congressman Mitchell, his voice urgent. "Judge Thompson, turn on the news now." I pulled over and switched on the car radio, my heart racing. The newscaster's voice filled the car. "Breaking news. Shocking footage has emerged of a police officer using excessive force against an unarmed black teenager. The incident, which occurred last night in downtown..." I listened in horror as the details unfolded. The victim was just 16 years old, an honor student with no prior record. The officer involved had a history of complaints against him, but had never faced serious disciplinary action. It was a tragically familiar story, but this time there was irrefutable video evidence. As I sat there, rain pattering on the roof of my car, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me: anger, sadness, and a grim sense of vindication. This was exactly the kind of incident we had been fighting to prevent. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Lisa. "Are you seeing this? They're talking about the Thompson Act on every channel." I realized with a start that she was right. As the story of the police brutality incident dominated the news cycle, commentators and politicians alike were pointing to our proposed legislation as a potential solution. The Thompson Act, once seen as a long shot, was suddenly at the center of a national conversation. Over the next few days, the momentum became unstoppable. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with demonstrators carrying signs that read, "Pass the Thompson Act now and justice for all." Even those who had been skeptical of the need for reform were finding it hard to argue in the face of such clear evidence of systemic problems. Amidst this whirlwind, I received another summons from the Judicial Conduct Committee. As I entered the hearing room, I steeled myself for the worst. But to my surprise, the mood was different this time. The committee members looked at me not with suspicion, but with a newfound respect. The chair of the committee cleared his throat before speaking. Judge Thompson, in light of recent events and after careful consideration, we have decided to dismiss the complaint against you. Furthermore, we commend your courage in speaking out on these critical issues while maintaining your judicial integrity. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. It wasn't just a personal vindication, it was a sign that the tide was truly turning. As I left the hearing, I found a crowd of reporters waiting outside. Among them, I spotted a familiar face, the young reporter who had interviewed me shortly after the incident with Officer Daniels. She pushed her way to the front, microphone in hand. "Judge Thompson," she called out, "how do you feel about the committee's decision? And what's next for the Thompson Act?" I paused, considering my words carefully. "I'm grateful for the committee's decision," I began, "but this isn't about me. It's about creating a justice system that truly serves all Americans. As for what's next, we push forward. The recent tragic events have shown us that we can't afford to wait. The time for change is now." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. I found myself shuttling between Washington, D.C. and my home district, testifying before committees, meeting with lawmakers, and speaking at rallies. The Thompson Act was gaining sponsors by the day, with even former opponents coming around in the face of public pressure. Then, on a crisp fall morning, it happened. I stood in the gallery of the House of Representatives, watching with bated breath as the votes were tallied. When the final count was announced, the chamber erupted in cheers. The Thompson Act had passed with an overwhelming majority. As I made my way out of the Capitol building, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made my heart skip a beat. "Judge Thompson, this is Officer Daniels. I know this might seem out of the blue, but I've been following your work on the Thompson Act. I was wrong that night, and I'm sorry. Your efforts have opened my eyes to a lot of things. If you're willing, I'd like to talk about how I can be part of the solution." I stood there on the steps of the Capitol, the weight of everything that had happened in the past months crashing over me. From that humiliating night in the parking lot to this moment of triumph and unexpected reconciliation, it had been a long, difficult journey. But as I looked out at the city before me, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't the end, of course. Passing the act was just the beginning. There would be challenges in implementation, resistance from those who feared change, and the hard work of transforming deeply ingrained cultural attitudes. But for the first time, it felt like we were on the right path. As I headed home that evening, eager to share the news with Lisa and the kids, I found myself reflecting on the power of turning pain into purpose. What had started as a personal humiliation had become a catalyst for national change. It was a reminder that one voice, one story could make a difference. The sun was setting as I pulled into our driveway, casting long shadows across the lawn. As I stepped out of the car, I saw Lisa and the kids waiting on the porch, their faces expectant. I felt a surge of love and gratitude for my family, who had stood by me through it all. "It passed," I called out as I walked towards them. Their cheers of joy echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a fitting celebration for a victory that belonged not just to me, but to all of us who believe in justice and equality. As we gathered for a family hug, I knew that while this chapter was closing, a new one was just beginning. There was still work to be done, bridges to be built, and minds to be changed. But tonight, we would celebrate. Tomorrow we would roll up our sleeves and get back to work, continuing the long, necessary journey towards a more just and equitable society for all. In the months following the passage of the Thompson Act, I found myself at the center of a whirlwind of change. The legislation had set in motion a series of reforms that were reshaping law enforcement across the country. But as with any significant change, the path forward was not without its challenges. I remember clearly the day I received an invitation to speak at a National Police Chiefs conference. It was a crisp autumn morning, and I was in my chambers, reviewing case files, when my assistant brought in the letter. As I read it, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was an opportunity to address the very people who would be implementing the changes we'd fought so hard for, but I knew it would be a tough crowd. The conference was held in a large convention center in Chicago. As I walked into the auditorium, I could feel the tension in the air. Hundreds of police chiefs from across the country were seated before me, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases, outright hostility. I took a deep breath as I stepped up to the podium, reminding myself why I was there. This wasn't about me. It was about creating a better, more just system for everyone. I began my speech by acknowledging the difficult job law enforcement officers do every day, the risks they take to keep our communities safe. I saw a few nods of appreciation, a slight easing of the tension in the room. Then I shifted gears, speaking candidly about my experience that night with Officer Daniels. I described the fear, the humiliation, the sense of powerlessness I'd felt. As I spoke, I could see the discomfort on many faces, but I also noticed some softening, some dawning recognition. I went on to explain the Thompson Act not as a punishment for law enforcement, but as a tool to help them do their jobs better, to build trust with the communities they serve. I outlined the increased funding for training, for community policing initiatives, for mental health support for officers. As I concluded my speech, the room was silent for a moment. Then slowly applause began to build. It wasn't thunderous by any means, but it was genuine. After the speech, several chiefs approached me, some to express support, others to voice concerns, but all willing to engage in dialogue. It felt like a small but significant step forward, but not everyone was ready to embrace change. In the weeks that followed, I received reports of resistance in some police departments. There were stories of officers refusing to comply with new training requirements, of chiefs dragging their feet on implementing new policies. One particularly troubling incident occurred in a small town in the Midwest. The local police department had been slow to adopt the new guidelines, and tensions with the community were running high. Things came to a head when an officer was caught on camera using excessive force during a routine traffic stop. The video went viral, sparking protests and calls for the officer's dismissal. The police chief, a man named Frank Hollister, went on local TV to defend his officer, dismissing the new regulations as bureaucratic overreach. I knew I had to intervene. After consulting with Congressman Mitchell and my team, I decided to visit the town personally. It was a risky move. As a federal judge, I had to be careful about appearing to interfere in local matters. But I felt that if we couldn't make the act work in places like this, we'd failed before we'd even begun. The town was small, barely more than a main street and a few residential neighborhoods. As our convoy pulled up to the town hall, I could see protesters on one side of the street, holding signs demanding justice, while a group of off-duty officers stood on the other side, arms crossed defiantly. Inside, I met with Chief Hollister. He was a burly man with a thick mustache and a permanent scowl. As we sat down in his office, he didn't mince words, telling me bluntly that he thought the Thompson Act was making it impossible for his officers to do their jobs. I listened patiently, then began to speak. I shared stories of departments across the country that had successfully implemented the new policies, of the positive changes they were seeing in community relations. I showed him data on reduced complaints against officers, on improved solve rates for crimes. As we talked, I could see Chief Hollister's stance begin to soften. By the end of our meeting, while he wasn't fully convinced, he agreed to give the new policies a fair shot. It was a small victory, but an important one. Over the next year, I found myself making similar visits to towns and cities across the country. Each place had its own unique challenges, its own resistances to overcome. But slowly, steadily, we were making progress. One of the most rewarding aspects of this period was seeing the positive changes in communities where the act had been fully embraced. I visited a neighborhood in Detroit that had once been known for its high crime rate and tense relationship with local law enforcement. Now, thanks to new community policing initiatives, officers were a regular, welcome presence in the neighborhood. Crime rates were down, and more importantly, trust was being rebuilt. I met a young officer there named Sarah, who had been initially skeptical of the new approach. She told me how she'd come to see the value in building relationships with the community she served. "It's not just about enforcing the law," she said. "It's about being part of the community, understanding their needs, their fears. It makes us better officers, and it makes the community safer." But perhaps the most profound moment came when I received another message from Officer Daniels. He asked to meet, and despite my initial hesitation, I agreed. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. As Daniels walked in, I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the arrogant swagger I remembered from that night. He seemed smaller somehow, humbled. We sat in silence for a moment before he began to speak. He told me about the soul-searching he'd done since our encounter, about the implicit biases he'd been forced to confront in himself. He'd gone through the new training programs mandated by the Thompson Act, and for the first time he'd really listened to the experiences of people of color in his community. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "not just for what I did to you, but for all the times I let my biases affect how I did my job. I'm trying to do better now." As I listened to Daniels, I felt a complex mix of emotions, lingering anger and hurt, but also a sense of hope. His journey was a testament to the potential for change, even in those who seemed most resistant to it. Our conversation that day was the beginning of an unlikely partnership. Over the next few months, Daniels and I began speaking together at police academies and community forums. His perspective as an officer who had confronted and overcome his own biases was powerful, complementing my legal and policy expertise. As the second anniversary of the Thompson Act approached, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. The changes we'd set in motion were significant, but I knew that true transformation would take years, perhaps generations. I was reminded of this reality when my son, Marcus Jr., now in high school, came home one day visibly upset. He told me about being stopped and questioned by a police officer while walking home from a friend's house. The officer had been polite, he said, but the experience had left him shaken. As I held my son, comforting him, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why we had fought so hard, why we continued to push for change. Not just for ourselves, but for our children, for future generations who deserve to live in a world where they were judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. The next day I reached out to the local police chief. We had a long, frank discussion about the incident and about ongoing efforts to build trust with young people in the community. It was a reminder that our work was far from over, that we needed to remain vigilant and committed to progress. As I sit here now, looking back on the journey that began with that fateful night in a restaurant parking lot, I'm filled with a mix of pride, hope, and determination. We've made real, tangible progress. The Thompson Act has changed policies and practices across the country. We've seen reductions in incidents of racial profiling and excessive force. We've seen improvements in community police relations in many areas, but I'm also acutely aware of the challenges that remain. There are still resistances to overcome, minds to change, systems to reform. The work of creating a truly just and equitable society is never done, yet I remain hopeful. I think of Sarah, the young officer in Detroit, embracing a new way of policing. I think of Officer Daniels confronting his biases and working to be part of the solution. I think of the countless citizens who've raised their voices, marched and advocated for change. And I think of my children, of all the children who will grow up in a world shaped by the changes we're making today. They are the reason we can't give up, the reason we must continue to push forward, to strive for a society where true justice is not just an ideal, but a reality for all. As I prepare for another day of work, another speech, another meeting, I'm reminded of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Our job, I believe, is to keep bending that arc, to keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles we face. The journey that began with a moment of injustice has become a lifelong commitment to creating justice. And though the road ahead may be long and challenging, I know that together we can create the change we wish to see in the world. The Thompson Act was just the beginning. The real work, the work of transforming hearts and minds, of building a truly just society, continues. And I, for one, am ready for the challenge. As the years passed, the impact of the Thompson Act continued to ripple through our society, transforming not just policing practices but the very fabric of our communities. I found myself at the center of this ongoing transformation, a role that was both exhilarating and exhausting. 5 years after the Act's passage, I received an invitation that would mark another significant milestone in our journey. The President of the United States wanted me to chair a new commission on racial equity in the justice system. It was an opportunity to take our work to the next level, to address not just policing but the entire spectrum of racial disparities in our legal system. I remember the day I arrived at the White House for the first commission meeting. The grandeur of the setting was a stark reminder of how far we'd come, from that humiliating night in a parking lot to the highest corridors of power. As I walked into the Roosevelt Room, I was struck by the diversity of the assembled group: legal scholars, civil rights activists, law enforcement officials, and community leaders from across the country. The President joined us, emphasizing the importance of our task. He spoke about the progress made through the Thompson Act, but also about the work that remained. As I looked around the table, I saw determination in every face. We all knew the magnitude of the challenge before us, but we were ready to tackle it head-on. Over the next year, our commission traveled the country, holding hearings in cities and small towns alike. We heard heartbreaking stories of lives derailed by a biased system, but we also heard inspiring accounts of change and progress. In a small town in Georgia, we met a former inmate named James, who had turned his life around after serving time for a non-violent drug offense. He now ran a program helping other ex-offenders reintegrate into society. His story highlighted the need for comprehensive reform, not just in policing but in sentencing, incarceration, and re-entry programs. In Chicago, we visited a pioneering court program that focused on restorative justice rather than punitive measures for juvenile offenders. The results were promising, with lower recidivism rates and improved outcomes for young people who had run afoul of the law. But we also encountered ongoing challenges. In a city in Texas, we heard from a group of Latino residents who felt their community was still being unfairly targeted by local law enforcement, despite the changes mandated by the Thompson Act. Their frustration was a sobering reminder that policy changes alone weren't enough. We needed to address deeper cultural issues and ingrained biases. As our work on the commission progressed, I found myself reflecting more and more on the personal toll of this journey. The constant travel, the emotional weight of the stories we heard, the pressure of knowing that our recommendations could shape the future of justice in America. It was all taking a toll. One night, after a particularly grueling day of hearings, I found myself sitting alone in my hotel room, feeling overwhelmed. I picked up my phone and called Lisa. Her voice, warm and reassuring, was like a balm to my weary soul. She reminded me why we had started this journey and why it was so important to see it through. Reinvigorated, I threw myself back into the work. As we compiled our findings and formulated our recommendations, a clear picture began to emerge. We needed a holistic approach to reform, one that addressed not just policing, but every aspect of the justice system, from laws and sentencing guidelines to prison conditions and re-entry programs. When we finally presented our report to the President, it was with a mix of pride and trepidation. We were proposing sweeping changes, some of which we knew would face significant opposition, but we also knew that half measures wouldn't be enough to address the deep-rooted issues we'd uncovered. The President's response was encouraging. He pledged to make our recommendations a cornerstone of his domestic policy agenda. But as we'd learned with the Thompson Act, passing legislation was just the beginning. The real challenge would be in implementation. In the months that followed, I found myself crisscrossing the country once again, this time advocating for our Commission's recommendations. I spoke at law schools, police academies, community centers, and state legislatures. Each audience presented its own challenges, but I was heartened by the growing receptiveness to our ideas. One of our key recommendations was the establishment of civilian oversight boards for police departments. This was met with resistance from some law enforcement groups, who saw it as an infringement on their authority. I'll never forget a tense meeting with the leadership of a major police union in New York. The union president, a gruff man named Mike, didn't mince words. He told me bluntly that his members felt under attack, that they were being asked to do an impossible job with one hand tied behind their backs. I listened carefully, acknowledging his concerns. Then I shared stories from our hearings, stories of good officers who felt empowered by the changes, who were building better relationships with their communities. Slowly, I saw Mike's stance begin to soften. By the end of our meeting, while he wasn't fully convinced, he agreed to work with us on implementing the oversight boards in a way that addressed his members' concerns. It was another small victory in our ongoing battle for change. As our recommendations began to be implemented across the country, we started to see real, tangible results. Racial disparities in arrests and sentencing began to decrease. Community satisfaction with law enforcement improved in many areas. Recidivism rates started to drop as more resources were devoted to rehabilitation and re-entry programs. But perhaps the most profound changes were the ones that couldn't be easily quantified. I saw it in the eyes of young people of color who told me they were considering careers in law enforcement, something they never would have imagined before. I heard it in the voices of veteran officers who spoke about the positive changes in their relationships with the communities they served. One day, about 7 years after that fateful night with Officer Daniels, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from a young man named Tyrell, who had been in and out of the justice system since he was a teenager. He wrote to tell me that he had benefited from one of the new diversion programs established under our reforms. Instead of going to prison, he had received counseling, job training, and support. Now he was employed, going to college part-time and mentoring at-risk youth. Tyrell's letter ended with words that I'll never forget. Judge Thompson, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I want you to know that your work changed my life. For the first time, I felt like the system was trying to lift me up instead of keep me down. Thank you for not giving up on people like me. As I sit here now, a decade after the night that changed everything, I'm filled with a profound sense of gratitude and hope. The journey hasn't been easy. There have been setbacks and disappointments along the way. We still have a long way to go before we can truly say we have a just and equitable system for all. But when I look at how far we've come, I'm amazed. I think of Officer Daniels, who went from being the face of the problem to a passionate advocate for change. I think of the countless officers across the country who have embraced new ways of serving and protecting their communities. I think of people like Tyrell, whose lives have been transformed by our reforms. Most of all, I think of my children and grandchildren. My son, Marcus Jr., is now considering a career in law enforcement, something that would have been unthinkable to me when he was born. My granddaughter, Amelia, is growing up in a world where seeing people of all races in positions of authority is normal. As I prepare to step down from the bench and take on a new role as a full-time advocate for justice reform, I'm filled with a sense of purpose. The work is far from over, but I'm more convinced than ever that change is possible. That night in the parking lot, as humiliating and painful as it was, set me on a path that has allowed me to contribute to that change in ways I never could have imagined. I often think about what I would say to that version of myself, standing there with his hands on his car, feeling powerless and afraid. I would tell him that this moment, as difficult as it is, will be the catalyst for something greater, that his pain and anger will be transformed into a force for positive change, that he will play a part in bending the arc of history towards justice. As I close this chapter of my life and prepare to open a new one, I'm reminded of the words of anthropologist Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We have changed the world, in ways both big and small, and we'll keep changing it one step at a time, until the promise of equal justice under law is a reality for every American, regardless of the color of their skin. The journey that began with a moment of injustice has become a lifelong commitment to creating justice. And though there's still a long road ahead, I face it with hope, determination, and an unwavering belief in the power of change.